Another area in which we did research, and we had a team on each one, was on the Rohingyas. These are refugees from Burma that went to Bangladesh. The Rohingya, I won't go into the history of how they got there, but it came up at the recent conference meeting in Geneva, in which the government, the UNHCR, talked about repatriating them and maybe resettling some of them in Bangladesh, and the Bangladesh government effectively said, no dice, nobody's settling here, they're all going home. And yet the research showed that none of them could go or would go home. There'd been 2 exercises in repatriation before, one in which they forcefully de facto repatriated them, and they were persecuted even more and fled again, and a second one in which they rebelled against being repatriated. There's not going to be any repatriation of the Rohingya. There's not going to be any settlement of the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and it's very clear, and there are reasons for it, and we gave the reasons. Here's a group that needs to be resettled, and the question is, how come they're taking the ones from Thailand, or in the next case study, the Bhutanese from Nepal, but not the Rohingya? And we speculate on it, but we give no definitive answer. We think it has something to do with their background. They're Muslims, they had some radicals among them, etc. And there was a fear, and therefore there's no initiative to take them. Yet they're probably the worst off refugees of all the group we studied, not counting some of the African groups. And it's a particular case of a dilemma which nobody's really facing. There are also refugees in 2 situations in which about 25,000 are in the camp and another 100,000 are in what's called Cox's Bazar. They live among the community, and they're discriminated against, and there's lots of suffering in Bangladesh, which is already very poor. A third case study we did was Nepal, of the Bhutanese. And you have to know the refugees from Bhutan are ethnic Nepalese who migrated to Burma, to Bhutan. And there's a gap that India controls in between the 2 countries, and India doesn't allow them to go back, and certainly Bhutan won't have them back. And one of the results of the research was to show that, that in fact, one of the reasons they couldn't go back was the population of Bhutan wasn't 2 million, as had been advertised, but a recent census showed there were only 600,000 Bhutanese, ethnic Bhutanese. And the ratio of their fear of being overrun by a different population than their own was part of the reason for resistance. There was also the fact that the regime was regarded as a benign kind of dictatorship rather than a threatening one. And so the international community, i.e. several countries, it wasn't that big a group, decided to take them, again, over 5 years and resettle them. And Nepal, once it was convinced that they wouldn't have to take any more, wouldn't be a magnet for others, agreed that they could go. We did research in Sri Lanka on internally displaced and protracted refugees. And there was a dilemma because we had really difficulties doing this research because we ended up in the middle of a war. In fact, in my visit there to verify some of the findings, in fact, I couldn't go in the field because of threats, of death threats we received. And I was under the sponsorship of the former Dean of Medicine at a big university. He was the one who received the death threats, not me, but it was about me, if he took us into the field. Because one of the findings was, in fact, that what was going on was a rearrangement of the population in Sri Lanka to make sure that the Tamils, who were Hindus, didn't constitute more than 20–25% in any one area, so that they could eliminate the threat. And the determination of the government was, in fact, to militarily finally defeat the Tamil Tigers, which they were on the way to do. So there was an issue, a settlement that's going to happen totally independent of the international community, without the international community's intervention, and by coercive means. one of the biggest projects was on Afghanistan. And here we had the benefit of Susan Schmeidel as part of the team, and she was German, but had worked 6 years in Afghanistan. And there are more Afghan experts in Australia, perhaps, than in the United States. There's 4 really first-class scholars there on Afghanistan. And there you found that very complex patterns of movements, because it's very hard to count on who is internally displaced, who's in a protracted refugee situation, because there's movement back and forth across the borders according to old migration routes and how people moved, etc. There was a problem of the corruption and the lack of rule of law in the whole way in which it was being done, and here is where the issue of the conjunction between refugees and how you solve the peace equation is very critical of what happens and what the result will be. And there's a big controversy on how that's handled, and I won't go into that because of a shortage of time. The last one we did research on, and I'll end with that, is Iraq. And there you have not a protracted refugee situation, but one that's going to become one. Because there you have a process of ethnic cleansing going on between 3 groups. And anybody who didn't belong to those 3 groups, Sunni, Shiite, or Kurds, was kicked out effectively. Palestinians kicked out, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, all the 2 million Christians used to live in Iraq. It's down to less than 100,000. These people will not be allowed to come home. And there we're creating a protracted refugee situation because the West isn't doing anything about resettling them. And they're all over the Middle East, primarily in Jordan and Syria as the main countries. And again, you see a lack of vision and a lack of action to do anything about them. And one of the lessons, general lessons, as I've said, I'm finished, one of the general lessons I've said is you can begin to correlate situations to understand which of the durable solutions is applicable. From our studies, and it's another book that's coming out at the end of this year, we hope, is to find that whenever the source of the conflict is ethnic conflict, they're as part of the nation-state building at that point, and they're kicked out, they don't return except by coercive means. If they come back with military force and they win, then they can return. They don't get back voluntarily. And therefore, to talk about repatriation as the primary solution is an illusion. And in fact, often you can't talk even about settlement in first countries of asylum. It's where resettlement's appropriate, and one of the things you find is that we talk about burden sharing, but it's mostly talk because we bear very little of the burden of taking the refugees. And if we want to really do something about protracted refugee situations, we have to step up to the plate and do something. Thank you.